Welcome to the Borrow Better webinar from the VIN Foundation in collaboration with the VBMA, the Student Doctor Network, and VIN, the Veterinary Information Network. My name is Jordan Ben-Shia. I'm the Executive Director of the VIN Foundation. Thank you all for being here this evening. A few bits of housekeeping. Within the next couple days, you'll receive an email with a recording of this webinar, an in-depth coverage of the Q&A questions and answers, along with some additional information, including helpful resource links. So be sure to keep an eye out in your email for that. And if you have any questions, you can always email studentdebt@vinfoundation.org. And I will also put that link in the chat window of the webinar. During this webinar, we will be asking poll questions, and you will also have the opportunity to ask questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. If you see a question you like and you want to make sure it is answered, you can choose to upvote that question as well as comment on that question. Please ask all of your questions in the Q&A section and not in the chat window. It'll help us make sure we organize them and get through all of them correctly. If you are having technical issues, please comment in the chat window. I will be sharing questions throughout the webinar as they become pertinent to the information presented. A little bit of information about the VIN Foundation. Most foundations give money, the VIN Foundation gives resources. The VIN Foundation believes a healthy animal community depends on a healthy veterinary community. The VIN Foundation resources help veterinarians thrive so they can help our animals and those who care for them. Each of the resources are available to all pre-vets, veterinary students, and veterinarians at no cost. We are regularly updating the resources with the most up-to-date information, and we are simply here to help. As I mentioned, we are doing this webinar in collaboration, and the Veterinary Business Management Association, the VBMA, is a student-driven organization dedicated to advancing the profession through increasing business knowledge, creating networking opportunities, and empowering students to achieve their personal and professional goals. We are also doing this in collaboration with the Student Doctor Network. The Student Doctor Network, also known as SDN, brings together thousands of current and future healthcare students and professionals into one community where they can share information, offer guidance, and provide encouragement to their peers and those coming up behind them. Whether considering a gap year, struggling with the intensity of their classes, or navigating the match, SDN members can find someone who understands what they're facing. And last but definitely not least, we are very thrilled to be collaborating with VIN, the Veterinary Information Network. Established in 1991, is the first and largest online community for veterinary professionals. Many call it the largest group practice in the world, where colleagues and dedicated VIN consultants help each other with cases and issues 24/7. VIN has a vast amount of content and tools that a large group of colleagues work to create, organize, and index to ensure that VINers have access to the information they need when they need it. The VIN community brings together over 69,000 colleagues worldwide. VIN has always been and will always be for veterinarians by veterinarians. Today's webinar's host is Dr. Tony Bartels. He is a VIN Foundation board member and a student debt educator with VIN. And now I'm gonna turn it over to Tony.
Great, thank you, Jordan, and thanks everyone for joining this evening. I hope to kick off this semester with a little bit of information that you can use to hopefully reduce some of the stress that you might be feeling around student debt, or that you might be feeling in the future when it comes time to repay those student loans. Hopefully I'll be seeing some of you all soon throughout this semester as I start visiting some of the schools and talking about this in a little bit more detail as it pertains to your specific school. But we figured that early in the semester here is a great time to kick this off, because you've undoubtedly received your financial aid award for this semester, and there are some things that we're going to talk about tonight that can help you actually still reduce the amounts that you end up borrowing, and overall reduce the amount that you have to pay back when you get into repayment. So let's dive right in. And as we work our way through this, feel free to type in any questions that you might have into the question and answer window, and then others of you can can vote on those questions, and it'll kind of raise them up. So if we know which questions you all are thinking, and we can better address those along the way or at the end. But here's a little bit of what we'll cover tonight. So what Borrow Better means, and that's really getting familiar with your financial aid awards, right? I mean, we certainly don't go into veterinary school to be experts on student loans and finance, but this is just one of the ugly side effects of obtaining your veterinary education, and that's paying for it, and it can be quite expensive. So you're going to have to know what options are out there. You know, they've got it pretty much on autopilot now. I mean, you fill out your FAFSA, they determine how much you can contribute, which is usually not much, and then they offer you a series of student loans, which if you're not very familiar with, it can be easy to end up with a lot of the most expensive loan types, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So estimating your educational costs, we're gonna make you look at some of those tuition fees and your living expenses and show you some tools that you can use to better match that against your budget, so you know how much student loan you actually need to take and how much you might be able to return or reduce in the future. And we'll share some strategies that we've learned along the way, right? So this is really about taking some of the information that we've obtained over the last several years and passing it along to you when you're in the position to use it now. Let's do the why I'm kind of, or who am I, right? I mean, why do I care about this? And mostly it's because I've got a lot of student debt myself, and I married a veterinarian, and she has a lot of student debt as well. And combined, we have $400,000 of student loans, right? So we had to get creative in terms of figuring out how to manage that amount of student loans. We currently use Revise Pay As You Earn, which is an income-driven repayment plan. We're not going to focus too much on the repayment options today. We're going to mention them in passing because they're going to be important in terms of determining which loans that you might want to use depending on your situation. But just to let you know too that it's doable, right? So I mean, we've been working on repayment now for 7 or 8 years, and we've been using income-driven repayment, and it's been working quite well for us in terms of having a manageable student loan monthly payment and being able to meet our other financial goals. I would encourage you while you're here to review the National Student Loan Data System. If you've borrowed in the past, so if you have loans from before veterinary school, or maybe you've taken some out so far, then you can access the National Student Loan Data System at nslds.ed.gov and then pull the record of those student loans that you already have. I alluded to this just a few minutes ago, but a lot of this came out of the fact that we talk to veterinarians, fourth-year students, very recent graduates, and when we talk about repayment options, we undoubtedly end up talking about some of the things that you can do during school to reduce this, or it just kind of reveals some of those tips and tricks that you could have been doing during school. And it inevitably, somebody's always like, oh, I wish somebody would have told me this sooner. And that's why we're doing this now, right? I mean, I know it's a busy time of year, and for those of you who have just started veterinary school, I'm sure you're feeling overwhelmed with all of the curriculum and information that you need to study for that first exam. But you can't forget about this stuff, right? Because it's really easy, like I said, to put this on autopilot. And by the time you graduate, you'll have a lot more student debt than you even imagined, right? And that can be a lot harder to manage going forward. So taking a step back and using a little bit of time and know-how from those of us who have already taken on the lumps and bumps, and using some of that advice, you can reduce some of your costs and therefore reduce some of that stress as well. So student loan repayments and student loans are complex, and finance may not be your forte yet, but we're going to use this as a way to kind of familiarize you with some of these concepts and make it not so scary. So here I've got a few polls that I want to trigger to know a little bit more about you, and that'll help us direct some of these additional materials. So I'm going to release the first poll here. You should see one in a second that allows you to contribute. And although these, I'm a veterinarian, my wife's a veterinarian, and all these materials and the informational resources that we have available on the VIN Foundation and Student Debt Center are geared towards veterinary school and veterinary students and veterinarians. A lot of this is applicable to medical school in general, as the concepts are very similar across the medical school environments and graduate professional school for that matter. All right, looks like we've got almost 80% of the folks or so that contributed to the polls. Give it a few more seconds here. All right, looks like it's not budgeted. All right, so looks like a majority of you are first years, so excellent. Thank you for joining. That's great. I know it's tough to get you to focus on this finance stuff, particularly while you're learning anatomy. So a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight, the biggest impacts can be made early on in the program. So I'm glad that a majority of the attendees are first year students, but that doesn't mean you can't take advantage of it if you're later on in the programs. So we're still going to talk about those and some of the data you'll be able to use and still take advantage of. All right, second poll. How much will it cost you to be a veterinarian? And your best guess, and I want you to include pretty much all of the student debt that you will accrue or what you think it'll cost you out of pocket to pay for this degree and what your balance will be by the time you graduate. We're almost up to that magical 80% number here. Always seems like there's about 80% of the people that contribute to the polls and 20% who don't. All right, so we can see here that we've got the majority of you are going to be in that $100,000 to $200,000 range, followed by the 200 to 300, and then a quarter of you in that 300 to 400,000, which is pretty good distribution there and probably pretty accurate. So from what we see in veterinary medicine, and that'll help us start the conversation, right? So knowing what it's going to cost us can help us target our borrowing strategy. And then I think I've got one more poll right now, because we can't talk about debt without talking about income. I always like to check in with you all to see what you think a new graduate veterinarian is going to earn once you finish vet school. Great, we're up to a number of people who have responded, so I'm going to end this one, share this with you all. So pretty good. So about half of you said between 70 and 90,000. That's the most recent data that we have available, right? So the 2018 graduating class, those that went on to do private clinical practice, so excluding those that went on to do internships and residencies, the average starting salary was about $83,000 per year. Of course, that number can be higher or lower depending on the type of veterinary practice that you pursue. If you go on to do internships and residencies, you're going to be looking at something closer to $30,000 to $40,000 a year. So for those of you who guessed that number, maybe you were thinking about the internships and residencies. We have seen, for those of you who guessed the 90 to 110, the 10% of you or so, we have seen the salaries in those ranges for certain, small animal urban environments. ER practice are commanding those kinds of salaries. So that's great. I mean, right now the market for new graduate veterinarians is very robust. So that's something for you to look forward to. It puts you in the driver's seat when you're negotiating those first starting salaries, and your income is going to be your resources that you use to service and pay down that student debt that you're accruing right now. All right, so enough with the polls for a little bit. We're going to come back to, again, why now, right? And that's because this cake for you is not baked yet, right? So you are in the process of borrowing. If you're in the first year of school, you've just started borrowing. Maybe these are your first loans. If you haven't been exposed to the student loan system before, maybe you've borrowed before vet school, but borrowing for medical school or veterinary school is very different than borrowing for undergrad. So there's things that we want to point out and make sure that you know, so you're not caught off guard by those different loan types and the interest rates and fees that are associated with those. Loans are inevitable. What can I do to change that? This is a sentiment we hear a lot from the students, and it's true because, you know, that again, this is not your primary concern. It is one of those side effects, but you don't want to completely put it aside, because that's how you end up with some unmet expectations by the time you finish the program. One of the, probably the most common thing that I see students doing, mostly because the system is set up to make it really easy, but it's, you take all that is offered to you and you worry about it later, right? And later is when you hit repayment, once you reach graduation. And depending on what your student debt total is and what your income is, it can be difficult to manage those two, right? So we want to worry about it now while you're in the process of borrowing, because this is when you actually have the opportunity to affect some of those numbers. Not all of them, but some of them you have the ability to affect. And we want to make sure we set yourself up for the best possible repayment, so you don't end up in an awkward situation that your career path cannot support. So most of you are probably familiar with FAFSA. You've already filled it out. If you've received your first student loans, they calculate what's called an expected family contribution. For those of you who have borrowed before in undergrad, in graduate school or professional school like veterinary medicine, you're considered to be independent from your parents, right? So that's a major difference between borrowing for undergrad and borrowing for graduate school, is while you can provide your parents' financial information, they don't consider it in the majority of cases. Veterinary school is expensive enough now as well that you may have to apply for what's called a direct grad plus loan as well. So anything that's above the maximum limits for direct unsubsidized loans for professional school may require you to fill out an additional direct grad plus application. Because you're attending a medical school and receiving a health education, you are also eligible, at least for the U.S. schools, for health profession student loans and loans for disadvantaged students. Those are loans that do require your parents' financial information. They're distributed on a need basis. So depending on how much is available in your school's pot in those particular categories and where you fall on the need scale, you might be able to obtain some of those. And there's some schools that have a robust account when it comes to those health profession student loans. Like I often see Michigan State students, UC Davis students, a lot of, some of the Iowa State and some of the other Midwestern schools have some pretty healthy health profession student loans available. So make sure that you're pursuing those if you haven't heard of them before, because those are one of the lower cost student loans that we're going to talk about. Your school cost of attendance, right? This is what the school estimates that it's going to cost you per year to obtain your veterinary degree. And that includes the tuition and fees, but it also includes an allowance for cost of living items. And we'll get into those as well. Your accreditation status, so the VBMA Council on Education accredits veterinary schools. If your veterinary school is an accredited veterinary institution and it resides in the US, then you are able to borrow a higher amount of certain loan types than others. If you're an accredited school outside of the US, you still are eligible for US federal student loans as long as you meet the eligibility requirements for that. But the amounts that you're able to borrow under particular loan types are different. We'll go into those as well. So for your cost of attendance, your expected family contribution and student loans, I'm going to use an example, one that I'm very familiar with. This is Colorado State University, the veterinary school that I graduated from. This is the cost of attendance for a resident, or they call them sponsored, veterinary medicine student for the 2019-2020 school year, right? So we have our tuition and fees and all of the different allowances in addition to the tuition and fees. So these are collectively called cost of living. So your school should present you with something similar when you're applying for financial aid. Colorado State is an accredited U.S. veterinary school, and that will become important in terms of determining the financial aid award. So our cost of attendance is the $57,448. Expected family contribution, again, because you're independent student, unless you're married or you have a significant amount of assets before you started veterinary school, it is quite likely that your expected family contribution is going to be zero or something close to zero. The expected family contribution calculation is quite complex. It really requires you to dig into your personal finances, but the majority of veterinary students that I see do not have a very complex asset portfolio, right? But if you do, then your expected family contribution might be something greater than zero. Assuming that it is zero, you would be eligible for the $57,448 in financial aid. The first $20,500 will come from direct unsubsidized loans. Because this is an accredited U.S. veterinary school, you are also eligible for an additional $20,000 in direct unsubsidized loans. So that'll make up the first $40,500. The remainder, you would have to apply for a direct grad plus loan, right? So if you wanted to receive amounts above the $40,500, you would have to fill out and be eligible for a direct grad plus loan. But the direct grad plus loans will make up the remainder of the cost of attendance not covered by direct unsubsidized loans, no matter what that cost of attendance is. That will be cut in half, right? So you'll receive 50% this fall, or you've received 50% this fall, and then you'll receive the other half in the spring when the spring semester starts. So in this example, if we received this financial aid award, we would have received $20,250 in direct unsubsidized loans and $84.74 in direct grad plus for the fall semester. So you're probably more familiar with looking at it in terms of a refund, right? So everything that does not go directly to the tuition and fees gets returned to you in whatever bank account that you have linked to your school account. Right, so if we have tuition and fees of $37,980, the remainder of this is going to be considered cost of living. So everything that's not going directly to the school, right? So the cost of living, or COL here, $19,468, makes up that total cost of attendance. Your tuition and fees, right, are required, right? That's what you have to pay the school to, for the honor of putting your butt in the seat there for the next 4 years, right? So that's going to be what allows you to obtain the veterinary degree. Your cost of living, however, is an estimate, right? These are negotiable, if you will, right? So this is what they think based on surveys and the credit hours and just generally what previous students have told them, and some other equations that certain schools use and states have set up. They will estimate an amount for you to for your expenses above and beyond the tuition and fees, right? So that's what you have to work with. In this case, for Colorado State, we've got about $19,468 that we have to work with, presuming I don't have any funds to cover my tuition and fees. So $37,980, which is the tuition and fees. So that can all be covered by the direct unsubsidized loans in this case, and they'll even leave me with an additional $2,520 remaining. I can still get that $16,948 in direct grad plus loans if I want. Everything that doesn't go directly to the school in the term for tuition and fees will be returned to me, right? So that's going to be the refund, if you will. So that $19,468 is going to be the amount that I will receive and be able to use to cover my living expenses for the remainder of this veterinary school year. Again, that's roughly breaks down to $9,700 for the fall semester and another $9,700 for the spring semester. That's my living allowance. But these are, again, these are the estimated allowance. So no, now your task is to figure out what your actual monthly expenses are, right? And I imagine that your actual monthly expenses are something less than this, right? That just tends to be what I see when students provide me their working budgets. The cost of living that the school estimates is usually an overestimate, right? So if you just go through and check the box and say, I'm going to take everything, you can definitely get everything. But it's up to you to determine whether or not you need everything. I've got a good example here, or a good question here from an anonymous person. How come this example has vet school tuition so cheap, right? So this is the in-state example, right? So this is an in-state tuition example. So the tuition and fees for an out-of-state Colorado State students are about $61,000, right? So that I use this example just because I attended Colorado State as a resident. But if you're attending a private or a foreign school, or as a non-resident, then your tuition and fees are going to be higher. Right? But the concept here is still the same. So your tuition and fees have to be covered by a certain amount of student loans. And then the living expenses will also be provided to you. It's just up to you to figure out how much of the living expenses that you need to take.
Tony, there's another question here, and you might cover this in a little bit. But a few people are interested, if you want to go on to do a residency or internship program, would it benefit you to work in a private practice first to help pay off the loans and then later go on to a residency or internship program?
Yeah, we'll cover that a little bit later when we talk about the student loans that kind of give you the most flexibility to handle those types of scenarios. But that's not something I'm going to address right now. But I will get to that one when we get a little bit deeper into the program here. All right, so here's what the breakdown is for the interest and fees on student loans, right? So we just went through an example of how a financial aid award might work and how it might be distributed. The direct Grad Plus loans are the most expensive loan types, at least in the federal system. So if you can avoid it, you want to reduce the amounts that fall into there. Of course, if you have a higher cost of attendance, more of those amounts are going to fall into that direct Grad Plus loan category. So this budgeting thing is even more important in those cases. The direct unsubsidized, so the $40,500, the first $40,500 is a little bit less expensive, and the fees are less expensive, but they do have these limits that the first $40,500 on a 9-month curriculum can only be covered by those direct unsubsidized loans, and then the remainder will be covered by these direct Grad Plus loans. Health profession student loans, or loans for disadvantaged students, they are at a much lower interest rate, and they are subsidized, meaning that they don't accrue interest while you're in school. So if your school offers those, then I would highly encourage you to apply for them. Right? You will have to provide your parents' financial aid or your parents' financial information. And as long as you're okay with going through that exercise, then you can essentially throw your hat in the ring for any health profession student loans or loans for disadvantaged students that school has available, right? So anything that you can borrow here will reduce the amounts that you have to rely on here, right? So those will definitely help you reduce the amount of interest that accrues, and will help you reduce the total cost during repayment. You can still borrow from a private entity or from family sources or other loan types that you find available. However, those are all very different, right? Every contract is different. A lot of times they depend on your credit history, which if you're a veterinary student, you probably don't have much of a credit history yet. So usually those interest rates are not very beneficial while you're in school. In those cases, they oftentimes want to have a cosigner. So they're either going to, entice your parents or maybe a spouse to co-sign on those, which again, you don't have to pursue any of those because the federal student loans will cover your entire cost of attendance. And usually the cost of attendance is an overestimate for what you actually need. There are scholarships and grants available, highly dependent on the institution that you're attending, but investigate those. We'll go into, and I have some data that shows some of the scholarships per school, and you may want to pursue those if you are attending a school that has a lot of scholarship, or at least say that they have scholarships that they've given out. And then if you attend a school that doesn't have very many scholarships, you might want to show up in their office and ask them if they can increase the amount of scholarships that they have available. So we'll cover that in a little bit. Interest rates change, right? So right now, these are actually quite low. They decreased from the previous year. And that's because we're in a historic low interest rate environment. We may even see the student loan interest rates go down one more time next year, right? You can visit this blog post here, and I've got a history of the student loan interest rates for the last 7 to 8 years or so. And you can see them kind of doing a funky trend where they've gone up and then they come down and they went up and now they're kind of back on the downswing again. But we can use that information to our advantage when we're estimating what our second, third, fourth year costs might be based on those interest rate trends. But what does a dollar cost, right? So this is one of the reasons why I'm super excited why there's so many first years here, right? And it's because the amounts that you borrow in the first year are the most expensive, right? It's because of the interest that accrues on those direct, unsubsidized and direct grad plus loans for the duration of school. So if we take an average start time and a general graduation date, those first year loans, those first loans that you receive in the first semester accrue almost 1,400 days of interest. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Didn't mean to make it more scary than it already is. So that results, that first year, for every dollar, and basically what this shows is for every dollar that you borrow in a direct grad plus loan, it's going to cost you about $1.31 in that first year. And for the direct unsubsidized loans, $1.24, right? So these health professional student loans for disadvantaged students, because they're subsidized and they don't accrue interest, they're dollar for dollar, right? There's no additional costs, there's no fees associated with those, which is why it's worth pursuing them if your school offers them. As you get further along in the program, because you don't have the amount of time for the interest to accrue, the cost of those loans goes down, right? So again, we can use this as really valuable information to help us make decisions early on in the program if we have the ability to affect the way we're borrowing. So just to give you an idea how much interest might accrue if you rely solely on the direct unsubsidized and direct grad plus loans for the duration of the veterinary program, based on how much you borrowed, and most people indicated that they would fall in this range here between $100 and $200 and then $200,000 and $300,000 range based on the poll. And you can see here that the interest charge for the duration of the program can be quite high, right? So we're talking about anywhere between $12,000 and $40,000, so almost an additional year's worth of tuition just in interest based on how much you borrow, right? So again, why it's so important to think about how you're borrowing and take any opportunity that you can to reduce the amounts that you're borrowing, because it will reduce the amount of interest that you accrue. To use this, and I'm going to use I'll show you the tool when we get to the resource section, but we have what the VIN Foundation Student Debt Center has, an in-school loan estimator, and we can put in these various borrowed amounts that you might be experiencing and your graduation year, and put in some various interest rates and see how much interest might accrue. That kind of gives us a baseline for a total cost, and then anything that we can do between now and when we graduate can help us reduce that total cost. So we'll cover that in just a little bit. I see a question in here, a couple of questions about the health professional student loans. So a couple of people would like more information on the health professional student loans. How do I apply for this? So I would first visit your school financial aid website and see if they offer health professional student loans. And if you can't find the information that you need, then that's worth a visit or a call to your financial aid office, right? Every veterinary school is going to have a financial aid office. You can even reach out to your dean's office to see if they can tell you if they have health profession student loans available, and they may even have some information on how to apply for that. But usually that's covered by your FAFSA application. And if you provide your parents' financial information and your school offers health profession student loans, then you will satisfy those requirements for at least throwing your hat in the ring. All right, so your cost of attendance matters, right? This gets to, thinking about, and you've already indicated via the poll what you think your cost is going to be, but we see from the AVMA data that gets published yearly, some very distinct cost profiles, right? So what we see here, public is a state school, right? So somewhere where that you're able to attend as a resident and receive the in-state tuition. We see the average amount that folks borrow and graduate with is much lower than if you graduate from a private school or a foreign AVMA accredited school, right? So when you see the average student debt is $170,000, or in 2017 graduates, for those that had non-zero debt, it was somewhere around the $170,000 to $175,000 range. That averages everybody, right? So that's going to be an overestimate likely for those folks who are attending in-state schools. It's going to be quite an underestimate for those of you that are attending foreign AVMA accredited schools, right? So the person who had the question from Ross, who said, how come I'm using the Colorado State, the low cost tuition, is just to highlight that there are a variety of cost profiles, and where you fall in this tuition and school category is going to determine your cost profile, right? So setting your expectations, knowing about how much you're going to finish school with, right? This is a starting point. This is a ballpark estimate based on past graduates, but then we have tools in the VIN Foundation Student Debt Center to help you narrow that down and increase the precision of that estimate for you based on where you're attending school and how the resources that you have access to affect your borrowing. All right, so let's get an idea from this poll on your tuition status. Again, knowing this stuff really helps to know what your cost profile is going to be, and it'll also help us when we get to using the in-school loan estimator. We're almost there. Got one straggler. All right, thank you. So we've got mostly in-state folks here, which is great. And then we've got smattering of out-of-state and some that are paying the private tuition rate at a non-US school, right? So that exercise of which student loans that you qualify for and the location of that of your school is going to matter in terms of the student loans that you have available. All right. So federal student loans, we're going to cover some of the basics of the various ways of financing your education here, right? So what I'm illustrating here is these health profession student loans are the most beneficial loan out there, followed up by the direct unsubsidized loans versus the direct RED plus loans that you have access to through the Department of Education and the federal student loan system. You can reduce the amounts. I often find that people aren't quite clear on that when they receive their financial aid award. Again, the Department of Education, if nothing else, has gotten extremely efficient at making it very easy for you to accept your entire financial aid award, right? It's actually harder to reduce the amounts that they offer you or return them later. You do have a 120-day window from the time that you accept any federal student loan to return it. Right. So if you discover that you took more than you needed, right. So one of the reasons again why we do this early in the semester is if you find that you took more than what you needed, you can return those amounts. And if you do that within 120 days of when you receive them, then it will also return the interest and fees with it. Right. So that's an extremely valuable exercise to go through. Rather than paying the interest on those loans later, you can return them and it'll return the interest and fees and the principal with it. Right? So a return of $1 goes a lot farther than paying the interest on $1 that you've already borrowed. So, and that's a long time, 120 days, right? So just to give you an example, if you started your semester on August 12th, you have almost all the way until your winter break to return those funds. Right, so almost to the end of the semester. So you've got some time to work with, and maybe you haven't been in school for quite a month yet, or it's just a month and you're not quite sure what your monthly expenses are. You don't give it another month or another 2 months, right? And you still are within that 120-day window to take advantage of returning those funds that you may have borrowed in excess of what you need. Same with the spring semester, right? So if you start early in January, you have almost all the way until your summer break to decide to return the amounts that you have in excess, right? So don't think that that's something you can't do. You've got a lot of time to analyze that and see if that's something that you can benefit from. Set a calendar reminder, right? You're all on the computer now. Open up your Google Calendar, your iPhone calendar. Set yourself a reminder for somewhere around Thanksgiving break or spring break in the spring semester to just do a check-in and see, hey, how much do I have left from what I received and how much have I used, right? Am I going to end up with thousands of dollars more than I need? Or, do I have a little bit of buffer to return some of these awards? Take advantage of that, right? So just set yourself some reminders when you have a little bit of downtime to think about something other than the clinical educational part of veterinary medicine and see if you can reduce the borrowed amounts that you've taken on for this semester.
Tony, someone has a question. How do you go about returning it?
Yeah, so you can either do that through your financial aid office, or if you make a payment on a loan that you received within 120 days, it should treat it as a return, or what they'll do is what they call canceling that loan amount. But I would want to make sure, right? Rather than just making that payment through my loan servicer and expecting them to cancel it, which means that they'll cancel the interest and fees associated with that as well, I would double check with my financial aid office to make sure that they don't have a more formal process that they want you to go through. So you can use your loan servicer and go through them and ask them if this will be credited or treated as a loan cancellation, or go through your financial aid office to see if there's something that you need to do other than making a payment towards that loan during that window.
And someone else said, if you return part of your loan amount during the semester and need to pull out more, is that possible?
Yes, absolutely. So you can always go back and retrieve, or if let's say that you didn't take everything that was offered to you and you decided, or you found out that you needed more, you can always go back and take more student loans up to what your financial aid offer was approved for during the course of that semester, right? So that financial aid award is good for that whole year, right? So just because you decline it in the beginning and you need it later, you can go back and get it, and the interest doesn't start accruing until you actually receive the funds, right? So it's actually a more efficient way to do it, is to take less than what you think you need, and then if you need more, going back later and getting it. Right? Because usually what happens is people will take more than what they need and then they don't return it, right? Because you have to go through that extra step, that extra hoop, things get busy, and then you just end up keeping all of those student loans. And I've seen so many students that I've met with in fourth year that have been really good at budgeting and keeping their living expenses down while they're in school, but they didn't take the necessary steps to reflect that in their financial aid award. So they end up with, I've had people that have ended up with $35,000 more in their account from student loans than they actually needed, and they're knocking on the door of graduation. Right? It's okay to keep a little bit more as a buffer, but that's too much, right? You don't need to take $35,000 more in student loans that are accruing at 6 and 7% interest rates through the duration of veterinary school, right? So, you know, it's not enough to just keep your living expenses down. You have to also take that extra step and reflect that in your financial aid awards to make sure that you're not paying for that later.
One other question just about this. My plan was to keep refunds for the first 2 years to pay off a private loan prior to starting vet school, refinance it. That has a higher interest rate than the FAFSA loan. Is that a good choice?
Oh, that's a really good lead into the private loans. Let me cover the private loan stuff, and then we can talk about that one, because that's an interesting case. So let's first kind of cover what private loans are. And in this context, I'm talking about anything that's not a federal student loan, right? So anything from a outside organization, a bank, your school can sometimes offer you loans. They're not federal student loans. They're still kind of considered private student loans, foundations, some other organization other than the Department of Education that's offering these student loans of the federal government. Private loans, as the question that was just asked, most of the time I see private loans from before veterinary school, right? Because private loans for veterinary school are usually unnecessary, because you can cover your entire cost of attendance with federal student loans at the graduate professional school level. It doesn't mean that you can't or don't have access to private loans. You can always use private loans instead of federal student loans, and your financial aid award should reflect that change. But generally speaking, there's no need to use private loans unless you choose to. And that brings us to the next part, where there aren't many beneficial private student loans for veterinary school. I have seen a couple at very small number of institutions, but even those can have some complicating factors for when you enter repayment, because they're outside of the federal student loan system. It makes repayment much more complicated. I have yet to, and I was thinking about this when I was putting this presentation together, I have yet to look at somebody's student loan portfolio and say, wow, that's a great private veterinary school loan, right? So there are not that many out there. So it usually is not very beneficial to replace federal student loans with private student loans for veterinary school. Now, that said, the person who asked the question about using the extra federal student loans for veterinary school to pay back less beneficial private student loans from before veterinary school, that can be beneficial, right? But you still got to be a little bit careful about doing that too, right? I mean, you're taking out more loans to pay for a previous loan. And while that can free up some flexibility for when you're done with veterinary school, I would still do that with some caution, right? I mean, I think it's a good move, but you know, you still have to be careful and cognizant of the fact that you're replacing one loan with another. Right? You're still going to have to pay all of this stuff back. But I have seen in certain cases that private student loans can be limiting when it comes to post-veterinary school opportunities, particularly if they don't have very good deferment provisions, right? So if you have the ability to pay those private student loans off while you're in veterinary school to make your student loans more flexible going forward, then I would take advantage of that opportunity. Right. So really what it comes down to is the private student loans are just not as flexible as the federal student loans. It's very difficult to find a private student loan that has a lower interest rate than a federal student loan for something like graduate school. If you can, you have to be careful about how much you take, because again, it's going to decrease your flexibility in terms of pursuing things like internships and residencies after school when you don't have the income to cover some of those private loans. So you have to scrutinize those private loans really carefully, right? What happens to the interest during school? I've seen private student loans that capitalize monthly, right? Where your federal student loans don't capitalize at all until you enter repayment. And by capitalization, I mean that they take that interest and they add it to your principal, which means it essentially compounds the interest, right? So I've seen some crazy private student loans at very high interest rates that almost act like credit cards, where they take that interest that accrues every month and they add it to the principal, which means you accrue more interest. And when you don't have a way to pay it, that can really spiral that student loan out of control. Thankfully, the federal student loans don't do that. Right? Your student loans, your federal student loans during school do not compound or capitalize. They will capitalize when you graduate, but that is a fair trade-off versus an alternative. You also have to look at what the minimum payment is and when does it begin after school, right? This is where we get into the decreased flexibility part. Oftentimes, those private student loans don't have, or they just don't really care about internships and residencies, right? They're not structured in such a way that they let you defer them for years at a time, right? So if that's the case, then you're going to have to earn a certain amount of income just to pay back that private loan. And that's how it can limit your post-graduation opportunities if you have a significant private loan balance, right? Because you can't let those loans go unpaid without having some serious financial consequences. Family loans and personal funds. So this is one that I see, this is probably the most complex, right? Because when your family gets involved, yes, I know they want to help, and sometimes it can be extremely beneficial, but it oftentimes means that they don't quite understand the student loan system and what it ultimately does to you in the future too, right? So you have to approach this carefully, right? So first of all, is your family offering to pay your education as a gift, or are they offering you a loan, right? If it's a loan, then make sure that you have some, at least on the back of a napkin somewhere, some kind of expectations for what that loan repayment is going to look like, right? What are the terms? How much are they expecting per month? When are they expecting you to start making payments, right? Your parents might not understand that an internship and residency can add another 4, 5, 6 years after veterinary school for your education, right? Are they going to be okay with not receiving any payment for that duration of time if you take that kind of career path? If it's a gift, right? Great, congratulations. That's a wonderful opportunity to have. The biggest impact will be made earliest on in the program, right? So if they have funds that they want to contribute towards your veterinary education, have them do it up front, right? The first, second year of vet school is going to have the biggest impact because that's when those federal student loans cost you the most, right? So if you can have that gift offset how much you have to take in federal student loans, then that will really decrease the amount of interest that accrues and decrease the amount that you have to pay back in repayment. There's even some tax benefits if they put it directly towards tuition and fees that they can experience. So best impact is to contribute it directly towards your tuition and fees early on in the program. Personal savings, or if you're married, and this happens all the time too, my spouse is helping me through veterinary school, or maybe you're pulling some money from savings, or you're working during school, and that's fine, right? So it's just a balance. There's definitely a balance in terms of how much goes towards your veterinary education, how much you should take in student loans, right? Because the catch-22 is you're in a unique position and have access to the federal student loan system. And that's extremely favorable, right? So you have access to some very flexible, relatively low cost funds while you're in veterinary school, right? So you don't want to completely empty out your savings account or, hurt your future prospects or your spouse's future prospects just to keep your student loan balance down for veterinary school, right? So it's definitely a balance. If you are going to use personal or spouse funds to reduce student loans during school, don't pay the interest on the loans that you're borrowing, right? Use those funds to borrow less. So reduce the amount that you're actually borrowing or contribute it directly to the tuition and fees so you don't have to take out as much student loans in the future or for additional semesters. But that money will go farther by reducing the amount that you're borrowing than it will paying the interest on the amounts that you've already borrowed. Don't forget to prioritize. Again, this is where the balance comes in. You should have an emergency fund. I see too many veterinary students graduating with credit card debt, right? You can avoid that by having an emergency fund, right? So come up with some kind of measure, 3 to 6 months of expenses. That's a little bit tough to do while you're in school, but you should have an idea of what your monthly expenses are while you're a veterinary student. Multiply that by 3 or 6 and try to have that amount in an emergency fund so you don't have to use a credit card, right? Because it can be really easy to let that credit card debt compound and increase while you're in school and have minimal ways to generate income to repay it. Particularly as you get deeper and deeper into the veterinary program, it becomes harder and harder to work. There's more and more demands on your time. It's easy to let that credit card debt get out of control, right? So don't even let it get started. Have that emergency fund first before you think about taking additional funds and putting it towards your schooling. If you are working, consider even contributing to a retirement fund. That's probably one of my biggest regrets during veterinary schools. I had a job all the way through up until 4th year when they didn't allow us to have jobs. And I wish I would have contributed more towards my retirement while I was in school, right? Because long term, that money has the opportunity to grow exponentially. So take advantage of those opportunities if you have some income. And then I might think about reducing my tuition and fees and living expenses when I have those other areas of my financial health covered, even as a veterinary student. So don't mortgage you or your spouse's or your family's future in lieu of student loans. I do have a great case that we'll go through at the end that can illustrate the awkwardness of relying too heavily on family finances when you have access to the federal student loan system. All right, so one more poll here. See what is most stressful for you. And the stress related around or the related to debt is complicated, right? We've seen some studies come out that indicate that student debt is one of the biggest stressors that there is in veterinary medicine right now, right? So it's hard to get away from, but it's personal, right? It's different for everybody. All right. This is probably the question I am most interested in from you all. I'm always curious what types of stressors there are there. I'm still hanging out. I'm gonna hold on for that one more person. Maybe it's not gonna happen this time. All right. So what we got here. So here we see that half of you owing money to anyone stresses you out, right? So that's, it's valuable to know, right? So if it's just having any kind of debt that stresses you out, then we want to make sure that that's, that at least it's the most flexible and we'll show you some tips and tricks that you can use to hopefully reduce that kind of stress. Owing money is not stressful for anyone, 0%. I guess that's good. All right, so scholarships and grants. So in 2018, about half of veterinary students received scholarships, and the average amount was about $5,500, right? So that's published by the AAVMC. That's a global snapshot across all of the schools. Some schools are much better than others. So you have to look at it at a more granular level, and you can. So in one of the maps that they have available, you can see the amount or the percentage of students who receive aid and how much they receive. And 6 vet schools report more than 75% of students receiving aid, and 6 vet schools report less than 25% of students receiving aid. So this is when I alluded to, visit this graph, right? Visit this graph and see what your school shows for the percentage of students receiving aid. And if you're in one of those schools like Florida, Illinois, those are the 2 that stand out to me that are of the 75% of students receiving aid and you didn't receive any, then you may want to visit your financial aid office and find out if there's some way that you can receive some of those scholarships. Right? But if you're attending one of these schools that report less than 25% of students receiving aid, I would want to go into that dean's office and find out why they don't have very much scholarship available, right? So either way, go knocking on some doors, see if there's some free money available for you to take advantage of, right? That's the great thing about scholarships and grants is it's free money. Right? It decreases the amount of student loans. It'll decrease the amount of interest. You don't have to pay it back, right? So it is worth your time to take a walk or make a phone call to those financial aid offices or your dean's office to sit down and talk with them about scholarships and grants available for you. Timing is extremely important. I see this happen occasionally. Sometimes the scholarships aren't awarded until after you've accepted your financial aid award, right? Which means now you've taken all of the student loans and you've received a scholarship. Sometimes they'll actually just give you cash, right? So now you've ended up with more, right? So you've got the cash in your account, you've got all the student loans in your account. If you don't return the funds equal to the amount of the scholarship that you received, well, you didn't really gain any ground, right? You just ended up with more money in your account, which is okay, but you're still getting charged for the student loan portion of that, right? The interest is still accruing. So if you do receive a scholarship or a grant that's outside of the window of when you accept or alter your financial aid, then again, here's another opportunity for you to go in there and reduce the amount that you've received in student loans that's in that 120-day window by the amount of the scholarship that you've received. All right, so loans during veterinary school. So if you have federal student loans from before veterinary school, this is a question that comes up almost every time I visit any school, is what do I do with my loans that I have from before veterinary school? If they're subsidized, which many loans from undergraduate are, leave them alone, right? They should be in deferment. They're not costing you anything. The ones that you're borrowing for veterinary school are costing you something. If they're unsubsidized, right? So there's unsubsidized loans available for undergraduate as well. Leave those alone, right? They're going to be in deferment and they're likely to lower interest rate, right? So don't use your veterinary school student loans to pay back a lower interest rate federal undergraduate student loan, right? You're not gaining any ground there, right? So you're better off returning those funds that you were going to use to pay back those undergraduate loans and letting the interest accrue on your undergrad loans and pay them back later, right? That will save you more money over time. And this kind of came up earlier, but for older loans at a higher interest rate than your veterinary school loans, you might consider paying down those interest or principal if possible, right? So that gets into that little gray area where you're taking extra loan amounts out to pay back other loans. But in certain cases, like what we talked about earlier, it can make sense. If you're confused, then visit the student debt folder on VIN, right? So we cover cases in excruciating detail on there. So everybody that's a veterinary student has free access to VIN, right? There's tons of information available on VIN. Most of it is medical content that you're going to benefit from in veterinary school. But there's some small, wonderful slivers of the VIN universe where we handle things like student debt that you're not quite sure how to do. You can post your situation in there and we can walk through it in some really high levels of detail, right? You can even post anonymously in there, and then we'll go through and help you craft a plan, right? So that's the ideal scenario. Visit VIN, post your case in the student debt folder, and we can get the answer that you need to figure out your student loan situation. And inevitably, your case is going to help others figure out their complicated situations as well. Private student loans from before veterinary school, again, are they subsidized, unsubsidized? What's the interest rate? How often do they capitalize? This is where you might consider paying down the interest with additional student loans. If you're unsure, post that in the VIN student debt folder. Loans you've already borrowed and received during veterinary school, borrow as little as you need. Return loans in that 120-day window if you can, and resist the temptation to pay the interest while in school. This was something I really didn't learn until I started visiting the schools and talking to you guys directly, right? So, and almost every time I visit a school, I have people raise their hand and whether or not they're making payments towards their student loans while they're in school. And a lot of the hands go up, right? And you have to wonder, where does that income come from? Where does the resources come from that you're using to pay down the interest on your student loans? And the most frequent answer is that they're coming from other student loans, right? So you're really not gaining any ground by taking out additional funds to pay back the interest. You're better off reducing the amount you borrow so you accrue less interest going forward. All right, last poll question. All right, almost up to our 80%. All right, so most of you look like you're going to have all federal student loans, which definitely makes things easier in terms of navigating repayment. The mixture, again, we're going to cover that in a case to illustrate how complicated that can get. But really, this is in order to make this repayment as easy as possible. Keeping as much of your veterinary school loan portfolio in the federal student loan system will be the most beneficial later. And here's some guidelines for knowing whether or not that is the case for you, right? And we can use, just like we use, and you'll learn more about this as we get closer to repayment and you start to hear some of the repayment talks, but we use the student debt to income ratio a lot when we talk about student loans. And if you're going to have a debt to income ratio of less than 1, right? So that means that your income is going to be greater than your student debt balance when you graduate or within a couple of years after graduating, then how you finance your veterinary education is really up to you, right? So you can look for the lowest interest rate opportunities available. Family loans make sense there. Mixed loan portfolios are okay in that scenario. Whatever's going to cost you the least amount during school and after is what you're shooting for. However, if your debt to income ratio is going to be greater than 2, which is the majority of the cases for those folks who use federal student loans to finance their veterinary education, you're going to want to use federal student loans exclusively if possible. Right? Those are going to give you the most flexibility when you get into repayment. They qualify for income-driven repayment and public service loan forgiveness if your career path should take you that direction after graduation. But the flexibility of income-driven repayment cannot be understated. Right? And the only way to take advantage of that flexibility is to utilize the federal student loans. If you're in this gray area between 1 and 2, again, the federal student loans provide you the most flexibility. Maybe depending on where you fall on that scale between 1 and 2, income-driven repayment might be optional for you, or maybe you're pursuing public service loan forgiveness, but you're not going to have that chance if you don't have the federal student loans, right? So mixed loan portfolios can be challenging in those cases. Again, I'll highlight that in the case that I have to share with you coming up here very soon. So tools you'll need, right? So your school cost of attendance, you should be familiar with that by now. Your financial aid award, you're going to get that every year at least. That'll be in your financial aid account with your school. Your budget, or an estimate of your monthly expenses, the dreaded B word there. The National Student Loan Data System can help. If you've already taken some student loans, you will see them reflected in that system, particularly if you want to, pull those that information from your undergraduate loans. That's going to be really helpful. And then you're going to turn to the VIN Foundation Student Debt Center, right? And we're going to use that here to illustrate how some of this works and how you can use that to estimate and better prepare for the rest of school when it comes to student loans. Plus or minus a spreadsheet, right? And I know every time I've mentioned a spreadsheet, when I go visit veterinary students, I kind of get a look similar to that emoji there. They're not the worst tools on the planet. They can actually make this stuff very easy to do, particularly your budget, right? I'm not talking about getting your budget down to the penny. I'm just trying to identify the major monthly expenses that you have. But knowing where you can alter those expenses is helpful, and a spreadsheet can be really helpful with that. All right, so let's look at a first-year veterinary student who's received her first financial aid offer, right? So didn't have any student loans from undergrad and has no NSLDS file yet, so we don't have a reason to go and retrieve that file. I have some personal savings of about $27,000 prior to vet school, and the family can pay $15,000 with college savings that they've earmarked for this veterinary education. Budget estimate, right? So it's going to be about $15,000 per semester. So this is an in-state student. Rent is $875 with utilities allocating about $1,100 per month. Health insurance, $20 a month. Car insurance, $130. Vehicles paid off, which is great. Renter's insurance, $20 a month, right? So identifying those recurring monthly expenses, right? We only have a handful there. That's not hard to account for, right? So you can put those into a spreadsheet, or you don't even need a spreadsheet in this case. Your total expenses are about $1,270 per month, and that's going to come out to about $15,240 per year, right? So again, I alluded to this earlier, but in most cases, the amounts that you're offered above the tuition and fees are usually more than what your actual living expenses are. And, you know, on average, living expenses across at least the U.S. schools tend to be somewhere around the $20,000 per year range, right? So which is, again, in this case, illustrates that you have some money to work with, and it may be a significant amount, right? If you can whittle down $5,000 per year from what you're offered based on what your actual monthly expenses are, that'll save you $20,000 of student loans plus all of the interest associated with that for the duration of veterinary school, right? So that's not a small amount. In this case, the financial aid offer is about $48,562. So the first $40,500 is covered by that direct unsubsidized loan, the remainder by direct grad plus loans. So if we look at this this is an actual financial aid package, right? So here we can see estimated cost of attendance. This is one of those schools where the school provides some institutional aid, sometimes referred to as scholarships, grants, right? So that's what I suspect this is, this roughly $6,000 difference. So the total offered was $4,800. Expected family contribution is $0. We can see that the direct grad plus loan amount was $8,000, broken down by each semester. Here we also have the direct unsubsidized award amount plus the additional amount that you can receive for attending a medical school like veterinary school, right? So that's the detail that makes up this financial aid award. Total is $48,562 per semester. They just cut it in half. Right, so now we can start playing with some of these numbers, and I'm going to take you over to the VIN Foundation Student Debt Center. So this is what that looks like. And if you do not have, I mean, you'll fall into one of these three categories. One of them is I'm planning to attend veterinary school, or I don't have an NSLDS file. That'll take you directly to the in-school loan estimator. If you've already started borrowing and you have some loans with the Federal Department of Education, you can upload or retrieve your NSLDS file and upload that information here. And once you graduate, you can retrieve your up-to-date NSLDS file, and we can make sense out of that information as well. But here we're going to focus on the in-school loan estimator. So we're going to go over to that resource. We're going to select our program. And in this case, this is the University of Florida. This is a resident. So if you borrowed everything as a resident of Florida, you're looking at something close to about $208,000 borrowed. Let's assume that they started on the 12th. We've got 4 years left to borrow, right? And this is where we're going to lean on the amounts that are let's put in our first case, right? So our base case, we'll call it. So the financial aid award offer was $48,562, right? And Florida has been one of the great schools that has not had a tuition increase recently, which is great, right? So we can at least assume for the time being that their tuition is not going to increase. going forward until proven otherwise. So 48,562, we will put that into the direct loan category. And now just because they haven't had a tuition increase doesn't mean that they don't increase the living expense allowances from time to time. So I'll add a little bit extra to account for increases in cost of living. So we can make this 49,000. Maybe we'll make this 49.5, and we'll round this out to 50,000 for the last year of school. Now the interest rates, again, they don't get set until May of each year. And I kind of shared with you before that, you know, they're on a trend now where they might go down again one more time, and then they'll probably come back up if they follow the trend that they've done the last two cycles. But this is something that you can update and adjust as we know the interest rates with a little more certainty as we get closer to those dates that you're borrowing. But this is what would happen if we borrowed all of the financial aid award that's offered, and it'll estimate the interest that's also accruing during school. So roughly 200,000 plus the 25,000 would give us a total balance at graduation of 222,111 at a weighted average interest rate of 6.15%. Okay, so that gives us our baseline, right? So that's if we return here, and that's what's listed here. Now we can test using the resources that this student has identified that they have access to and see what happens if we took the $15,000 family gift to deflect that tuition. So that's one semester's worth of tuition. That this person had $27,000 of savings, right? So let's allocate $15,000 of that savings to pay back or to pay the second semester of tuition, right? So essentially the first year of tuition is covered. We're going to reserve from that 27,000 an emergency fund. This is about 6 months of living expenses, right? So remember back, her estimated living expenses were about $1,500 per month. If we extend that out for 6 months, it's about $7,600 for an emergency fund, right? So don't take all of that savings and put it towards your cost. You want to reserve some of that just in case of an emergency. That leaves us with about $4,400 left. Estimating $15,000 for living expenses. If we use that $4,400 to reduce that further, we're looking at borrowing about $10,840 in that first year. So if we go back and adjust this, so we're going to change this based on our funding sources to 10,000, or actually we can put that in here. So we've got, what was it, 3440. I'm missing them. 30,000. Actually, let me do it this way because we were going to borrow about 10,840 in that first year. And I'm going to leave these alone, right? Because now we've used that family gift. We've used the savings that we had allocated for our veterinary education. And then we're going to presumably borrow the remaining amounts for the remaining 3 years. So if I generate that, now I get a separate number, right? So now I'm down, I borrowed 159,000. I accrued less interest. My balance at graduation is lower. My weighted average interest rate is a little bit lower, right? So that's all represented here. So the total cost difference between this baseline and this test one is 46,162. So if I used 34,400 of the funds that I had available for veterinary school in that first year, it would save me 46,162 versus the baseline, right? And now you can take this test and run with it. You can adjust. Maybe I don't want to use all that savings in the first year and I want to distribute it across various years and see what the cost difference is. You know, I'm not going to go through that exercise here, but you know, that if that's something similar or you have access to that kind of you know, funds to work with, and you want to see what's going to work not only to reduce your cost the most, although the information we've covered tonight would show that the more you reduce the cost in the first year, the bigger the overall savings are going to be. But if you're not comfortable with whittling down your savings that quickly, then you can adjust it, right? And you'll still save some money because you've reduced the most expensive amounts in that first year. So you can use that in-school loan estimator to give you that target and play with differences when they come up. Right. So let's say now, and we'll go back to, because I already know that the person who was the non-resident wanted to look at a more non-resident scenario. So let's go to Colorado State and look at more of a non-resident scenario. Right. So we can click on this number here, total non-resident 330,000, which is more on par with a private school or a foreign accredited school as well. We can use that to see, well, maybe I'm borrowing $80,000 a year, right? And I'm going to still use the same interest estimates, right? And if I have some funds to offset, I can enter those into this worksheet as well. This will give me a baseline of how much I'm going to borrow, how much I'm going to accrue in interest, and I can start to play with that from there, right? I know what my baseline is. Let's see, maybe I can get access to some health profession student loans for a couple of years and reduce these down a little bit. And see what the impact of that is, right? So now I can put a numerical value on the changes that I make to my borrowing strategy and see if it improves or how much it improves my financial situation. Okay, I have one last case. Thanks to those who are sticking around, and then we'll dive into some questions I haven't covered yet. But this is one that illustrates this mixed loan portfolio, and I want to get to this one because I think it really highlights some of the why we want to do this so early in your veterinary school career, right? And because once this person's cake is baked, right? So back to that cake metaphor, if you haven't baked the cake yet, you can go back and not step into this same kind of situation, right? So here's this person's loan history and Sigelman. So they were attending a private school. They managed to finish that education with about $118,000 of federal student loans. However, they also owe about $200,000 to their parents, right? Some of that is at no interest. $72,000 is at 3% interest. Right, so total student debt of about $311,000. So that's more on par with what some of you indicated you think yours is going to be, and it fits with more of a private or a non-resident situation. So let's go over to back to the Student Debt Center, and I'm going to take you to the My Student Loans page and show you how the NSLDS upload works. Right, so once you have your NSLDS file, in this case, this person graduated school, I can find where I saved that file. It's a text file, a .txt file, ugly looking, but it's not a mistake, right? That's the output format that they use. So here is what their situation looks like. So it shows you the $118,000 of federal student loans, shows you the interest, the weighted average interest rate, right? So just a few loans here. Here's the various interest rates from during her tenure at vet school. But we'll also show the income-driven repayment plans that she has access to, right? And she has access to the most beneficial ones. So pay-as-you-earn, revised pay-as-you-earn, the new version of IBR, all of her federal student loans based on when she started borrowing and the loan types that she has were eligible for these beneficial income-driven repayment plans as well as public service loan forgiveness. However, these loans from her parents are not eligible for any of that income-driven repayment or public service loan forgiveness. She went on to do an ER internship. Her income is about $70,000 for the first year, and then will be about $100,000 plus 22% of production. So pretty good there. If you don't know what any of that means, you'll start to as you work your way through veterinary school. But she also has this desire to move from small animal ER to maybe a government position. She has an MPH. She's interested in public service loan forgiveness or working for an organization that falls into the public service loan forgiveness realm. Well, this is great information and would have been better information to know when she was borrowing, right? Because that would have opened up the possibility of having all of this fall into the federal student loan system that could have been eligible for public service loan forgiveness, and her parents didn't have to put out $200,000, right? So that's really what happens when you have these mixed loan portfolios, particularly when they're quite high, right? The income that you earn after veterinary school is not really sufficient to pay back a $311,000 balance without having access to something like an income-driven repayment or a public service loan forgiveness, right? So debt-to-income ratio 4.4, right? So greater than 2 is going to be pretty difficult to navigate that in this split scenario. If they were all federal student loans, her payment would be about $403 per month, and that would be all that she has to worry about. In order to pay her parents back in 10 years, which is her target, she would have to pay $1,700 a month, in addition to the $430 a month that they're paying towards the federal student loans, right? So that's half of her take-home pay in the first year to satisfy all of those student loan payments, and about a third thereafter, right? So if it was all federal student loans, then it wouldn't be more than 10% of her income. So think about that in terms of, what do you plan on doing? What is your cost profile when you finish veterinary school? Right? What's your student debt to income ratio going to be? And then work your way back, right? How much flexibility am I going to need? If you're going to finish with something closer to $300,000 of student debt, then you're going to want to make sure all of that, or as much as possible, is in the federal student loan system, so you have access to these income-driven repayment plans and the flexibility provided by them, as well as the potential to work towards public service loan forgiveness. So family loans don't count for income-driven repayment. They don't count for public service loan forgiveness. And then it also, sets up these additional stressors, right? I have 2 loans now. I owe money to the Department of Education. I owe money to my parents. Who do I pay first, right? How do I satisfy both of those and still maintain my, relationship with my family? And will this change her career path? Right? She wants to go back and use her MPH and take a public service job. Generally, those are going to pay a little bit less, right? Maybe not, but will she have to alter those career desires in order to satisfy her student loans, right? And we don't want anybody to be in that position, right? Right now, the federal student loan system, right or wrong, really allows you the flexibility to pursue any career path, no matter what your income is. So take advantage of that, so you don't have to navigate some of these additional complexities that are layered on by not knowing how the different system works while you're actually in the act of borrowing. Okay, so per usual, I have gone over my target of 1 hour, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you have now. Here's a couple of ones that we may not have addressed yet, that you might be thinking, but let's go ahead and work through some of these questions. Oh, let's head back to the one that I put off initially. So if you want to go on to do a residency or internship program, would it benefit you to work in a private practice first to help pay off the loans, and then later go on to a residency or internship program? So that's a really complicated question, right? And generally speaking, your most direct pathway to a residency is going to be an internship right after you graduate. You can go out in private practice first and still get an internship or residency after that, but I wouldn't do it because of your student loans, right? I would do that because that's what you want to do in veterinary medicine, right? If what you want to do after you graduate is go into private practice, and then after being in private practice for a few years, you decide you want to specialize, then you can do that, right? Your student loans will not prevent either one of those scenarios, particularly if they're all federal student loans, right? You can use the income-driven repayment system to keep those payments low and navigate those low income periods during an internship and residency, and you don't have to try to pay them off first. And in reality, I mean, if you graduate with $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 of student loans, it's going to take you more than a few years to pay those back, right? So if you're going to postpone an internship and residency while you pay back your student loans, you might be waiting quite a while, right? So you don't have to wait. Don't let your student loans dictate that that situation. My financial aid office has an advertisement saying even repaying $5 per month helps with loan. Is this true? No, it's not true. And it's a lazy way of throwing something out there for student loans. That's too bad. I would love it if you'd email me after this and tell me who that is, because I'd like to have a discussion with them. There are definitely things you can do, and we covered a lot of them tonight, right? So borrowing less, right? So making direct impacts to your principal is what makes a difference. Throwing $5 towards your student loans when it's going to go towards interest while you're in school is not helpful, right? So you have to take a much more strategic approach to how you address student loans while you're in school. This is not one of them. If you have the option to pay down existing loans, interest with summer earnings, or keep it on hand for financial emergencies, which is better? So great question. It really comes back to that balance, right? So I would keep some of it especially if you're earning money, right? So you can go back to that list of priorities where I laid that out. So building an emergency fund, right? So working up to 3 to 6 months of what you determine your living expenses are, making sure you don't have any credit card debt. If you have summer earnings, that means you have the potential to contribute to a retirement account as well, right? And if you still have some left over, then I would either pay it directly to your tuition so you can reduce the amounts that you're taking out for the next semester, right? Or use those amounts that you have in excess to borrow less in the future. All right, so it looks like somebody, while we were doing the webinar, sees that her school offers health profession student loans. I didn't know this option existed until now. Can I give back money from my federal unsubsidized loan and then borrow from the HPSL this year? Or have I already missed the opportunity to get loans for the HPSL for this school year? That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that, right? So that's going to be something you'll have to check with your financial aid office to see if they've already used up all of the funds that they have allocated for health profession student loans. I will say that that's pretty common. It's for most veterinary students to not even know that their school provides health profession student loans, right? Which bodes well for you. So that pot may still have some money in it. And if you can go and meet the requirements to be eligible for them, then maybe you can get some of that health profession student loan for this semester and return some of the unsubsidized loans instead. So I'd be eager to hear the answer to that. So follow up with me and let me know if you find out that to be the case. When is the repayment program chosen? At graduation. So your repayment doesn't start until after you graduate, right? And we'll talk more about how to navigate repayment when you get closer to repayment. And we also did a webinar earlier this summer called the New Grad Veterinary Student Loan Repayment Playbook, right? And in that, we go through probably another hour and a half or 2 hours of how to, in detail of how to get started in repayment. That's on vinfoundation.org in the blog section. So you can find that information in there, but you don't have to worry about choosing a repayment plan until after you graduate. You can't actually choose a repayment plan until you graduate.
And we can link to that in the email that we're going to follow up with you guys as well.
Yep, absolutely. If you can take out more of the later in the year, so let's say you alter this question is related to going back and getting student loans after you've received your financial aid award. Is the interest accruing on your loan the same regardless of when you take it out during the year. Yeah, so you don't get charged interest until you receive the funds, right? So once you receive those student loan funds is when the interest starts accruing, right? So let's go back to the example of how your financial aid award is divided by two, and you receive some of it in the fall and some of it in the spring. The amounts that you've already received in the fall are accruing interest, but the amounts that you haven't yet taken for the spring aren't costing you anything because you haven't received those funds yet. Right? So the interest doesn't start accruing until you actually receive the funds, which is why it can make sense to take less and go back and borrow it later, right? Because the interest doesn't accrue until you actually take it. All right. I mentioned not paying off interest as you go through school and instead using that money to borrow less. What if you are in a longer combined degree program and the loans from your first year will accrue for longer? Yeah, the combined programs, those are complicated, right? So that's going to be one where I would encourage you to go to the VIN Foundation, to the VIN student debt folder, right? So log into VIN, navigate to the student debt folder, and post your case in the student debt folder, and let's walk through the specifics of that, right? Because I'm going to need to know the duration of your program, how much you've borrowed so far, what kind of funds you have available to maybe put towards that. If you're still in the 120-day window, I would really encourage you to return some of those funds if you can. But it might make sense, particularly if you're getting some kind of stipend, if you're doing like a dual PhD, DBM kind of thing. But it's really going to depend on the specifics of your program and of your financial circumstances. So we're going to have to, that would be one we would have to dive into more deeply. And the student debt folder is the best place to do that. Does having a scholarship reduce the amount of loans offered to me? Ideally, yes, right? So if you get offered a scholarship in the window where your financial aid award is being processed, that will be reflected in the financial aid award, meaning it will be reduced by the amount of scholarship that you receive, right? So that's in a perfect world where your scholarship goes directly towards paying your educational costs and it's reflected in your financial aid award. That doesn't always happen. That timing isn't always perfect, right? But it will reduce the amount offered if it hits your financial aid award when you receive a scholarship. Can I give a brief overview of public service loan forgiveness? Sure. So public service loan forgiveness, as the name implies, if you are working for a public service organization, and that's defined as a 501c3 nonprofit, government, state, tribal organization, you're an employee of that organization, and you have the right kind of loans, so federal direct loans, and you're using the right kind of repayment plan, which is an income-driven repayment plan. If you do all of those things for 10 years, 120 months, then you would be eligible to have the remaining student loan balance forgiven tax-free, right? So that is public service loan forgiveness in a 20-second nutshell. We have more information on that in the WikiDebt section of the VIN Foundation Student Debt Center. And if you have any additional questions about public service loan forgiveness, I'm happy to answer those, or you can also post those in the VIN Student Debt folder as well. How much of each loan, direct unsubsidized and direct grad plus, can you borrow if you attend foreign accredited schools? So if you attend a foreign accredited school, you're eligible for $20,500 of direct unsubsidized loan, and the remainder is direct grad plus. So whatever your cost of attendance is there, it falls into the direct grad plus category. So that's one of the side effects of a foreign accredited school, is that you don't get that additional $20,000 in direct unsubsidized. So that means that more of your student loan balance falls into that more expensive direct grad plus category. I think we've covered this one. Is it worth paying toward the interest while in school? Generally, no. Right. So I would highly encourage you, if you have the funds or the resources able to pay the interest while you're in school, then consider borrowing less. right? So think about that on a monthly basis, right? So if you've got a pot of money that you have earmarked for paying the interest on your student loans, take that same pot and reduce the amount of the student loans that you borrow. And you can do this exercise in the in-school loan estimator, and you'll see that you'll come out with less total balance if you borrow less than if you just cover the interest while you're in school. So I was told I can return money at any time by someone at my school. If I return money outside of the 120-day period, how will that affect things? Ooh, good question. So think of it as the you break it, you bought it, right? So once the 120-day window expires, those loans are yours. The loans, the interest, the fees, any return quote that you make at that point is essentially just a payment. It's a payment towards the interest, right? So the 120-day window for returning is unique in that if you return those funds during that window, not only does it return the principal, but it returns the interest and fees associated with that amount of principal that you returned. But yeah, that's incorrect. It's the 120-day window is specific, and any payment that you make after that is just essentially a payment. I have a loan from buying a house whose interest rate is higher than that of my graduate student loan rates. Would it be best to pay off this housing loan sooner, even if it means using my graduate student loan? Ooh. I'm not comfortable with that one. So I don't know that using your student loans to pay down a home loan is a good idea, right? You're going to have your home loan still. You're going to have more student loans. If you want to run the numbers on that one, we certainly can. That would be one I would want to dig deeper into on the VIN student debt folder, so we know how much the mortgage is, interest rates, what your plans are for that house when you're done with vet school, what you're planning on doing afterwards. I mean, there's going to be a lot of crystal ball in that one, right? So, but generally speaking, that I can stomach that for loans that I think I'm going to pay off while I'm in veterinary school to replace that higher interest rate with a lower interest rate loan. But that you might be stretching that one there. Okay, last question I have in the queue. I'm graduating this spring, and I've been told I should have 3 to 6 months of living expenses as a new grad for emergencies. You've been told correctly. That's great. If I don't have this currently, would you advise taking a little more out in loans this spring to plan for the unexpected things that might come up as a new grad? That's not a bad idea. And it's okay if you don't have the 3 to 6 months automatically when you graduate, right? Presumably you're going to graduate, you're going to get some kind of job that's going to provide some income, right? So when you have income, you can start allocating a small amount of that income towards your emergency fund and start building up to that amount. Now, if you're going to graduate and you don't have a dollar to your name, then absolutely, right? I mean, you don't want to have to use a credit card to, move out of your vet school housing and into your new practicing housing, right? So, I mean, you're going to need some money to navigate that time between graduation and starting your first job. If you don't have a buffer to accommodate that now, then using a little bit from the federal student loans is perfectly okay to get you to that point where you're going to be earning some income. All right, the last one is a thank you, and thank you all for sticking around, particularly those who stuck through the Q&A session. We will post this as a video in its entirety, and you can review it at your leisure later, and certainly ask us questions via email and on the student debt folder for anything that comes up for you while you're in veterinary school.
Yep, we will keep a lookout for an email. The email that you registered with, we'll be sending out an email in the next couple days with, as Tony said, a recording to the webinar and multiple other helpful resources. So make sure you keep an eye out for that. And thank you all so much for being here. Anything else you want to add, Tony?
I don't think so. Thank you, Jordan, for setting this all up, and thank you all for attending. And please feel free to reach out with any questions you have. You know, we're here to help. We've amassed quite a bit of do's and don'ts when it comes to student loans, even when you're in veterinary school, and particularly when you get into repayment. So don't be shy about asking questions, and the questions that you ask can help your colleagues as well. So let's figure it out together.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Thanks so much, Tony. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.